Coming up on this episode of the All Aboard Podcast, we kick off our Size Matters series where we talk about 3 little railroads with a great big impact. Have your tickets out of the envelope. All aboard, please. Now boarding on track number 8 is train number 1, the All Aboard Podcast, your twice weekly excursion into transportation excellence, and I am your conductor, Phil Bell, Enterprise B, PB Crisp, Mr. 645, a highly trained rail enthusiast who is 833% closer to being a highly trained broadcast specialist. And as always, I am blessed to hold the E. Hunter Harrison Chair here at the Bell Institute for Advanced Railroad Studies, where there are no degrees, because the learning never ceases. And for the first time this week, it is great to be back behind this, the Brunswick Green PLB microphone. Now, last week, we talked a lot about the Pennsylvania Railroad and some other large railroads that have an ongoing great impact on the rail industry. And after all, why not? Because if you're someone as big as the Pennsylvania Railroad, if you do the kind of things like develop Penn Center in Philadelphia, if you help to father the Metroliner, if you develop Madison Square Garden in New York City, and if you move people and freight for decades and decades across the country, of course you're going to have a big impact. But here's the thing. While size always matters, especially in railroading, it is not unheard of to have a small railroad that makes a really good impact. So I wanted to talk about 3 today, and in this case we're talking about the Pittsburgh and Lake Erie, the Richmond Fredericksburg and Potomac, and the Sandersville Railroad. These are 3 railroads from the past and the present that are continuing to have an impact on how we get around and how we move our freight from point A to point B. Now, let's get started, and the first is the Pittsburgh and Lake Erie. And this is a railroad that I've always been a big fan of because of its nickname, the Little Giant. And so this was a small railroad that runs from, or actually I should say ran from, because it does not do this any longer, Connellsville, Pennsylvania, all the way to Youngstown, Ohio, which is not very large, and it only had 231 route miles in 1930. But it got its nickname the Little Giant because it moved so much freight in a relatively small distance. And that's because, of course, between Pittsburgh and Youngstown, in both cities and nearby, you had an extensive set of steelmaking operations going on just about everywhere. And you've probably seen a lot of old pictures of what Pittsburgh and also Youngstown used to look like. Lots of smoke, you name it, everything everywhere, because it was such a big industrial heartland. And this propelled a lot of railroads, whether we're talking about the Erie, the Pennsylvania, the New York Central itself, and of course the Pittsburgh and Lake Erie, to large profits over the years because of all this industry. And the Pittsburgh and Lake Erie was right in the middle of it. Now, the story of this actually comes from a variety of places. One of the things I read is that its founder started the carrier because he had been mistreated on rates by the Pennsylvania Railroad itself. Now, this is not unheard of. There are many stories over years and years, and quite frankly, we can't tell which ones are true and which ones aren't true, largely because a lot of this is always going to be at least somewhat embellished, depending on who you're talking to, especially in the business world. But this led to the desire to create another railroad in the Pittsburgh area. And by the way, it wasn't just railroads. There's actually still a set of barges that ply the rivers in the Pittsburgh area as a way to get around railroad rates, or at least that's the way it was back during Interstate Commerce Commission times, but they continue to operate today. So the Pittsburgh and Lake Erie went to Pittsburgh, of course. It went to Youngstown, but despite its name, it did not go to Lake Erie on its own rails. Now, it was a satellite of the New York Central from 1880 when the Lakeshore and Michigan Southern, which is better known as the New York Central's connections west of Buffalo that got it into Chicago, purchased stock in the company. Another early investor in the Pittsburgh and Lake Erie was the Harmony Society, and this was a splinter group of Lutherans from Germany that moved to the United States, much like the Pilgrims, who were seeking religious liberty. So they came to the United States, they ended up in Butler County, Pennsylvania, purchased land, then said, you know what, this isn't working for us, went out to Indiana, near Evansville, which of course is on the Louisville and Nashville and Chicago and Eastern Illinois, set up Harmony, Indiana, and then ended up moving back to Pennsylvania, this time close to where the Pittsburgh and Lake Erie now exists. And one of the ways that you can harken back to that is Economy, Pennsylvania, which is northwest of Pittsburgh and is located at milepost PLE 18.4, which is West Economy. That's the name that CSX gives it on the carrier's Pittsburgh subdivision. Now, the Pittsburgh sub itself, for those of you who want to go out and rail fan or understand the carrier, is what runs between Pittsburgh and Newcastle, Pennsylvania. Now, the Pittsburgh subdivision is important because it's the majority of what remains the PNLE, but we'll get into why that's the case in a few moments. Now, turn your attention over to CP5 Cam. I will get a picture here for you, an idea of what the PNLE looked like in the late 1960s, early 1970s. Now, this map is from the Penn Central era because, of course, you can tell it has PC for those routes, which were former, in this case, of course, Pennsylvania and New York Central. But you see Pittsburgh here right in the center. And you see the main line that goes down to Connellsville, Pennsylvania, which for a very small town was for many years and still is to a certain extent a great railroad center. You have another branch. This is the Monongahela branch, which goes down to Brownsville. This is where it connected with the number 1 Pennsylvania Railroad, but also at Brownsville Junction, but a little bit further south, the Monongahela. And of course, we all know the Monongahela was a very important railroad because it carried a lot of coal and actually was one of the few to expand in the post-1909 era, when in the late 1960s, it actually had a new line that was built to serve another plant, a part of which still remains in operation to this day. Now, going north of Pittsburgh, you see it head up through Beaver Falls, Aliquippa, up to Newcastle. This is where trains today get on CSX's Baltimore, Ohio, and continue. But the PNLE itself continued into Girard and Youngstown. And that also includes the famous Gateway Yard, which still, the yard does not exist, but the tower still exists and has actually become a haven for people who like to just search abandoned industrial sites. But this gives you an idea of the role that Pittsburgh and Lake Erie played in that area. Now, you're probably wondering, all right, Phil, well, this is interesting. You know, Youngstown, Ohio, an important manufacturing center. Pittsburgh, obviously well known for a long time for being a very big steel center. Connellsville, small town. You've told us this is a place where a lot of railroads connected with each other, although not very large from a population standpoint. But why was the Pittsburgh and Lake Erie important? Well, what did I tell you a couple of minutes ago? For many years, and for almost its entire existence, it was a satellite of the New York Central. And why does that matter? Well, we all know that the New York Central, the Pennsylvania, and almost every other large railroad that existed wanted some way to compete with other large railroads that existed. And the New York Central had a very interesting plan called the South Penn Railroad. And this was going to be a way that it struck directly at the heart of the Pennsylvania Railroad by building a line that was more or less going through the same area, core area, that the Pennsylvania did, which was across from Pittsburgh through the Altoona area into Philadelphia. Now, by doing this, this would give the New York Central an incredible competitive advantage to go after the Pennsylvania Railroad. Of course, the Pennsylvania Railroad was no slouch, and what did they say? We're going to compete with you too, and they created the West Shore. So, for a period of time, you had this building, whether it was funding the Pittsburgh and Lake Erie, funding the creation of the South Penn on the New York Central side, and then, of course, the Pennsylvania doing the same with the West Shore. And this is what led to the famous conference of New York Central and Pennsylvania Railroad's president on the yacht of J.P. Morgan himself, the Corsair, where he basically knocked their heads together and said, look, guys, if you keep doing this, it's going to be ruinous to the industry. And ultimately, the South Penn, beyond the Pittsburgh and Lake Erie, was never actually built. So what became of it? Well, you've probably driven it. A large portion of that right-of-way is now the Pennsylvania Turnpike. The West Shore, on the other hand, a lot of it was built, and it was sold to the New York Central. And you have probably been around the West Shore a lot, especially if you're on CP5 Cam, because CP5 is on the West Shore. That is now CSX's river subdivision between northern New Jersey going all the way up to Selkirk Yard in the Albany area, and they have other portions in western New York where it serves as a bypass or additional capacity for the New York Central, former New York Central, I should say, Chicago line that CSX utilizes to get across the state of New York. So the Pittsburgh and Lake Erie, right off the bat, it was a critical artery. But it wasn't just the New York Central that it benefited. It also gave access to other railroads, their ability to get out into the Midwest. So keep in mind, once you get to Connellsville, Pennsylvania, who did you connect with? Well, the Baltimore and Ohio, for one. So this also gave the NYC the ability to route traffic over the B&O to basically long haul itself into Pittsburgh and then route traffic over the Baltimore and Ohio that would get it into the Port of Baltimore, also to Washington, D.C., and ultimately Potomac Yard, where it could be interchanged with railroads that were going to the south. But it also connected with the Western Maryland, which was another way to get traffic into Baltimore. And then, of course, we would see a variety of these railroads play roles in the various alphabet route schemes and so on to route traffic around both the Pennsylvania and the New York Central. And it is noteworthy that even though the Pittsburgh and Lake Erie was controlled by the New York Central for a very long time, it had no problem working with both the B&O and the Erie, and New York Central management simply let this happen. Now, another thing that I found to be very interesting about the PNLE is this, and here is a screenshot for those of you on CP5 Cam, assuming that our favorite website here, rrpicturearchives.net, opens up in some form, and that is the Alco PAs, which the New York Central purchased for the Pittsburgh and Lake Erie. And it looks like we're not quite going to be able to get that photo for you today. But what I always thought to be so interesting is whenever I would read about in Model Railroader or otherwise, and you had a new model of an Alco PA and say Pittsburgh and Lake Erie, and say, I don't remember the Pittsburgh and Lake Erie having any PAs. Well, they were painted from New York Central, and that is what made them so unique. Now, the Pittsburgh and Lake Erie, of course, had a very interesting time. Not only as a connection for the New York Central, the Baltimore and Ohio, and the Erie, but as time wore on and we got into the 1960s and the 1970s. Now, in 1970, its second parent, the Penn Central, went bankrupt. And so this started off a flurry of changes that we've discussed ad nauseum. But when the Pittsburgh and when Penn Central sold the majority of its rail assets to become part of Conrail, the Pittsburgh and Lake Erie, along with the Providence and Worcester, were a couple of railroads that were part of that network that managed to hold out. In the case of the Pittsburgh and Lake Erie, this was because the Penn Central actually owed the PNLE a large amount of money because it had been using it, as it did with all of its subsidiaries, as basically dumping grounds for a variety of its debts, and also milked them to help provide cash to keep the company going. And there are a lot of different references out there where you can read about the different ways the Penn Central did this, and all of this really does stem from the Pennsylvania Railroad and David Bevan and his efforts to keep the Penn Central afloat, although some people may say that it was actually probably a little more ruinous than originally expected. And it looks like I did get that P&LE picture to come up. So there you have a couple of Alco PAs painted for the New York Central chugging their way out of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which certainly doesn't look like something you'd expect with the New York Central, but those were in fact the Pittsburgh and Lake Erie's Alco PAs in the service of the New York Central. And I should add also that while they were painted for the New York Central, they could also be found hauling trains like the Steel Kings, which they operated in conjunction with the Erie, which allowed Pittsburgh, Cleveland traffic because the Erie and the Erie-Lackawanna connected in Youngstown with the PNLE, and this allowed for through movement directly to Lake Erie itself, hence ultimately the Lake Erie. But also the New York Central did this as well. So the Pittsburgh and Lake Erie does not become part of Penn Central, and it is sold to a company called Pleco, Pleco, Pittsburgh Lake Erie company that included Beloit Corp and a few executives from the Pittsburgh area who thought it would be a great idea to try to keep the carrier going. And early on, that really did work out. The Pittsburgh and Lake Erie gained its own identity, and that's when you see a lot of the 1970s era looking pictures of it, black and yellow and just a very gritty tough-looking railroad. But unfortunately, this did not work out, and Henry Posner III of Railroad Development Corporation, which is based in Pittsburgh and has been an incredible builder and developer of railroads all across the country. And I encourage you to go to Railroad Development's website, and we'll actually link that in the description so you can learn a little bit more about the work they've done. They're very good about writing papers and talking about it because they are proud of it, and also because Henry Posner is a great teacher and wants you to understand how the industry works as well. But long story short, when Plico was on the ropes and it looked like the railroad was going down, Railroad Development stepped in and they reached agreements with the unions in order to take the carrier over, as well as an agreement with Plico. Well, what happened? Well, it turns out that Pennsylvania's their version of the EPA, which I think was Department of Environmental Regulation, if I recall correctly, they suddenly came out of the woodwork unprompted and decided, hey, by the way, if you guys buy the company, even though the company is here, it's operating, and all you're going to do is continue its operations, we're going to require that you clean up a variety of areas back to, as it were, when Indian tribes roamed the land and there were no such thing as railroads in the first place. And they were so aggressive about this, not only were they going to require Railroad Development Corporation to do that, but they were also going to potentially foist that burden upon anyone who provided debt capital, lent money to the investment group that wanted to purchase the carrier. Well, this was a great way to scuttle the deal, because if you have, this obligation come about any time, even if this were going to be something that were to be done in the future, it wouldn't give you any opportunity to earn the money that you needed to set aside to do that. And that sort of intervention is unprecedented in almost any agreement, unless it's simply an effort to scotch it. What I find so surprising about this is not only that they were incredibly aggressive and ultimately killed jobs, because this resulted in the end of the P&LE, but also because typically when you have a deal like this where you have a prominent local investor who wants to purchase it, especially one that is well regarded for the way that they treat employees and so on, and you have wide buy-in, typically a lot of these different agencies and so forth that can be a problem usually find a way to not be as big a problem, or to get their desires modified in some way to get this sort of thing done. But in this case, that simply didn't happen. At the same time, as Posner complained, that P&LE management actually looked around and said, well, hey, if you guys can make all these deals with labor and other partners and so forth, I bet we can too. So you know what? Why don't you guys just step away from the table and we'll take it from here? Well, take it from there, they didn't do that very far, because in 1991, the P&LE went out of business. The corporation actually still exists, and I do believe that is related to that ongoing liability for some of the old locomotive shops, and they have gradually been selling off what property remains and cleaning it up, but the majority of the railroad was sold to CSX. The portion between Pittsburgh and Connellsville, which was such an important connection and enabled the connection to the Western Maryland, which itself has largely been destroyed between Connellsville and Cumberland, was taken up. The portion between Pittsburgh and Newcastle continues to operate, and that is the Pittsburgh subdivision. Today, you can ride a portion of the Pittsburgh subdivision when you're on Amtrak's Capital Limited, as it goes from the Keystone subdivision on its way to eventually getting on the former Pennsylvania Railroad to stop at the station in downtown Pittsburgh before continuing west on the Pennsy on its way up to Cleveland and ultimately Chicago over the New York Central. But the Pittsburgh and Lake Erie, at only 231 miles, does show that a small railroad can play a very, very mighty role in the development and growth of a region. And to be frank, even today, when you go to Pittsburgh, in fact, if you look at the thumbnail behind me, you see that was their headquarters building and main station in the city of Pittsburgh. It's now part of the Station Square development. And for those of you who are big league rail fans like me, I encourage you to stay at the hotel at Station Square and make sure to ask for a room that faces the railroad tracks. If you do, you won't be sorry. You may never want to leave. Now, let's move on to our second one, and that is the Sandersville Railroad. Now, the Sandersville Railroad is in many ways the polar opposite of the PNLE. Now, first of all, whereas the PNLE was 231 miles total, the Sandersville Railroad is a whopping 9 miles total, only 9. And let's see if we can't get a photo of what the Sandersville looks like. And I like this because in some ways, this reminds me a little bit of the Seaboard Airline in its 1950s into 1960s scheme, which is for Sandersville is white, but for them it was green with red. But this is it here. And it runs, as I said, a whopping 9 miles from Sandersville to Tennille, Georgia. Now, it was started with a lot of assistance from the Central of Georgia, which it connected with in Tennille, connects there with its successor, the Norfolk Southern, today. And it is currently building a 4.5-mile line to serve a rock quarry, and it has managed to cultivate a lot of controversy because it is seeking to use eminent domain power to condemn right-of-way in order to do that. Now, a lot of the people nearby are unhappy with this because they say, hey, you know what, we don't want additional truck traffic. Of course, the railroad's saying, well, that's because we're going to put that on the train. But also because they simply don't like the idea of someone coming in with eminent domain and taking some of their property. Now, it should be noted that in a variety of states over a variety of decades, railroads, even private railroads, have had the ability to utilize eminent domain in situations like this. So one of the things that we will be following at allthingstrains.com is how this case proceeds through the court and what the ultimate result is. And it's something to note, this is one of the reasons why Warren Buffett bought BNSF, because he will say railroads have a deep moat. And one of the reasons for that deep moat is if you ever want to build new railroad track, even if you're doing it with private funds, even if you're not attempting to go over public land, you will encounter a lot of opposition almost everywhere, even in places where there are no people. A good example with the positive train control rollout, Indian tribes had to be mollified, even though all this required was putting new antennas in existing locations, but somehow it happened. So that gives you an idea of the difficulty that is faced. So what the Sandersville Railroad is doing and trying to expand its traffic base beyond kaolin, which is the main product that they move, is going to be an interesting thing to follow, and we will keep you abreast of that. Now, they, as I said, move kaolin, and they interchange with Norfolk Southern, not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 times per day. And just as the Norfolk and Western was a conveyor belt for coal, the Sandersville Railroad is a conveyor belt for kaolin. Now, you're probably wondering, what is this? Well, first of all, it's spelled Kaolin. And if you've seen a train go by, you've probably seen some cars with that word on the side. It is a clay. It occurs naturally in Georgia, and there are several companies in that area that do mine this. And now it's been used in ceramics, medicine, coated paper, a variety of food products, toothpaste, cosmetics, and even in white incandescent light bulbs. And there aren't as many of those around now, but that is one of the big uses for it. And for many years, it was the active ingredient in kaopectate. So KAO, kaolin, kaopectate. That gives you an idea about how influential this product really is and why it's so important, and why the Sandersville Railroad has become one of the most profitable railroads in the entire country. Now, keep in mind, that's not in amounts, but that is profit margin, because pretty much what they do is take traffic from, take the clay from where it's mined right to the interchange, and they run their locomotives right back and do it again 4 times per day. Now, how influential has the Sandersville Railroad become? Well, one need look no further than Ben Tarbutton III, who is the current head of the Sandersville Railroad, and we're going to get him up here on CP5 cam because he is somebody who you might want to take note of. He has been a past chair of the state of Georgia's Board of Regents, and that's the entity that oversees the state's university system. So we're talking about UGA, University of Georgia, for those of you who are fans of the Dogs. And he is the chair-elect of the Georgia Chamber of Commerce. And for those who may not be initiated, Georgia, thanks to growth in the city of Atlanta, has become a corporate mecca. There are so many Fortune 500 companies, ranging from the Weather Channel to Delta Airlines to Coca-Cola, that are all based there. So while the Georgia Chamber of Commerce is actually the second most influential chamber of commerce in the entire state, the Georgia Chamber is almost on par with the Metro Atlanta Chamber, which means that someone that owns a 9-mile railroad, just a 9-mile railroad, is helping to make business decisions that impact the entire world because of the companies that are a member of the Georgia Chamber and because of the influence that they have. And that shows you how influential the Sandersville Railroad is, not just because of what it moves with the kaolin and having it being used in just about everything that we use in some form or another in our households, but also it's managed to catapult Mr. Tarbutton and his whole family into the upper echelon of state politics as well as national business influence. Now, there was a story, and I can't substantiate it, but it was really interesting to read about, that a member of the Tarbutton family at one point led the Central of Georgia, and also that the family would reinvest for many years a lot of its earnings into Southern Railway stock to the point of becoming the largest non-institutional shareholder of the Southern and then later the NS. Now, I don't know if that's true. There is a certain extent to which it is easy to track who the large shareholders are. However, a lot of shareholders will sometimes hold their stock in street name. That means it will just be listed as being under the ownership of a brokerage company, even a brokerage house, even if it's owned by either a small number of individuals or a large number of individuals. So if you ever search something like Yahoo Finance or otherwise, and you see something like Goldman Sachs being a major shareholder or Morgan Stanley being a major shareholder, those are majority of that are street name shares and not actually owned by that firm. So I can't tell if that's true, but the fact that rumor exists does speak to the influence that and success that the Sandersville Railroad has had, despite, as I've said on multiple occasions here, only being 9 miles in length. Now, the final railroad that we're going to talk about today is one that is very close to me, and that is because I rail fan on it all the time, and it is none other than the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad. Now, the RF&P had a main line of only 114 miles between Richmond and Washington. Let me make sure I get this right here. Between the center of the James River Viaduct in Richmond, Virginia, and Arlington, Virginia, in what is now the Crystal City area. And I will go ahead and put a picture from the RF&P. We'll have several up here on CP5 Cam because to me, it's not really a lot of fun unless we have some pictures for those of you who are tuned in. And that is one of their famous 484s, which they had the colonels, the generals, and the statesmen. And this was a statesman. They had them named after a variety of figures, historical figures from the South, because the RF&P was famous for linking North and South. Now, the RF&P came about because there was an effort to connect the northern railroads, which in this case ended up being the components of the Pennsylvania Railroad, and then, of course, the Baltimore and Ohio, with the Southern Railroads, which would develop into the Atlantic Coast Line and the Seaboard Airline. Now, as time went on, however, the RF&P became a critical link for a variety of railroads. Let's remember, again, on the northern end, you have the Pennsylvania and the Baltimore and Ohio coming in to Washington, D.C. through Maryland. But on the southern end, not only do you have the Atlantic Coast Line and the Seaboard Airline, you also have the Norfolk and Western that reached Richmond via trackage rights on the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac. You had the Southern Railway that came into Washington, D.C. and Potomac Yard. You also had the Chesapeake and Ohio that ended up utilizing RF&P rails as part of its agreement with the Southern Railway, which was a 99-year agreement that has since expired, which has allowed the C&O to go north of Charlottesville and ultimately come through Culpeper and Manassas. And that's how you had trains like the George Washington and the Fast Flying Virginian operating over the Southern Railway, although it was technically considered to be a C&O operation on that, because that was not a strict trackage rights agreement. But the RF&P was critical because it is the only significant north-south railroad in Virginia until recently. Now, what you would end up having later on after Potomac Yard was closed, and we'll get to that in a little bit, you ended up seeing Norfolk Southern develop a new interchange that went through Hagerstown, which had actually always existed, but this was it now working with Conrail to get a lot of that traffic that would go through Washington, D.C., and then, of course, passing through the RF&P's Potomac Yard to now head out west. And that is what created something that approximates what we have on the highway system, where you have an I-95 to the east and an I-81 to the west. Well, now railroads operating in the I-81 corridor, that is Norfolk Southern operating on the former Conrail, as well as the N&W to get to the Southern to the west, while to the east you have the RF&P, or the former RF&P now, connecting what used to be the Southern Railroads. It's now, of course, CSX, with what were the Northern Railroads, B&O and Pennsylvania. Now, the RF&P had two noteworthy assets. The first was Broad Street Station. This was in Richmond, Virginia, and of course, Broad Street Station being such a notable, beautiful building, and let's get that up here. It is now the Virginia Science Museum, so if you're down in Richmond, you certainly can go take a look. There's a former C&O Kanawha that at 284, which is parked behind the station, and you can certainly go view that there. But this is the building, actually a shot I took in December of 2021, and it is where all of a lot of your Southern passenger trains, the Seaboard Airline after, I believe it was 1960, somebody correct me if I got my year wrong, but also the Atlantic Coast Line coming in there so that they could hand those trains over to the RF&P for the trip north. And if you look back through the railroad literature enough, you'll see a lot of N&W 482s and 484s coming in because, of course, as I said, they would come up from Petersburg on the ACL and bring their through cars into Richmond to be put into trains that would operate over the Pennsylvania Railroad and to a variety of other points to get into the Northeast from the Pocahontas coal region. But of course, as we know, because freight is the dominant thing that moves on railroads and always has been, that arrangement also allowed for significant freight movement along the easterly route as opposed to moving it up through the Shenandoah, which did not become the favored way of doing things, of course, until the Conrail split in the late 1990s. The other significant asset that would play an even bigger role in the RF&P's future was, of course, Potomac Yard. And this is what Potomac Yard looked like in the 1980s. For those of you who live or visited the Washington, D.C. area, it is virtually unrecognizable now. To the right there, you see what is the Braddock Road Metro Station, and then you see this just big raft of tracks, an intermodal train there to the left. Almost none of this exists. The Metro certainly still does, and there are 3 tracks now that pass through the area, which are the RF&P main line, or as CSX calls it, the RF&P subdivision. This is a little bit better look of what that is like today. And you'll also see there that was during construction of the Metro, Washington Metro Station, for the Potomac Yard area. Well, what happened was after CSX consolidated the Baltimore and Ohio, as well as the Seaboard Coastline, you ended up with this missing piece where CSX came up from the south to Richmond, then it had to turn traffic over to the RF&P, and then it would get it back again in Washington, D.C., and take it over the Baltimore and Ohio, either into Philadelphia or to the west. And CSX looked at this and said, well, it doesn't make any sense, even though we control the majority of the stock in this railroad as a result of the acquisitions that it had made over the years, the various mergers, and also purchasing Conrail's share of it. But they didn't control it all, because that holdout shareholder was actually the Commonwealth of Virginia. And so they went to the Commonwealth, which by then was being run by Governor Doug Wilder, and they said, well, we'd like to buy it. And they said, well, look, if you want to do this, you're going to have to pay a lot of money. Now, the Wilder administration looked at this as being a way that they could help shore up Virginia's pension funds, because they figured if they could get their hands on Potomac Yard, rip out the tracks and redevelop it, they would be able to sell that land and what is developed on it to help pay for the variety of state worker pensions. And after a lot of difficult negotiations, which included CSX walking away from the table at least once, they were able to make this deal, and that is what led to the closure of the Potomac Yard, and then in 1992, the RF&P becoming a fallen flag and now part of CSX. So, If you go to the area today, you'll find a lot of housing, a lot of apartments, retail, you name it, all over the place. And it is almost unrecognizable that there was ever a rail yard there. One of the few exceptions is one of the buildings is actually named Notch 8, which of course is an allusion to the 8 notches on most diesel electric locomotive throttles. So the RF&P continues to play an important role, of course, even from a railroad standpoint, because it does host Amtrak's services to Norfolk and Newport News, as well as Richmond, in addition to Virginia Railway Express's service, which now operate as far as Spotsylvania County on the RF&P. And it's interesting to note that today in time, passenger traffic on the RF&P, while it doesn't have all of the beautiful trains of the days of yore, the Seaboard's Orange Blossom Special or the Atlantic Coastline's Champion, it does have significant Amtrak traffic multiple times a day, getting you to, again, Norfolk, Newport News, as well as Richmond, the Carolinian that gets you into North Carolina, the 2 Florida trains daily, the Silver Star and Silver Meteor, as well as Auto Train. So in terms of that variety, it is actually equal to, and maybe in some cases greater than it was in the golden era. And then when you add in the commuter services, which are critical to the Washington, D.C. region, because even in a post-COVID world where people are not going to the office as much, traffic is still insane. I know because I live in the area. So the small number of people who are taken off of the road to get on the railroad is very helpful and lets them speed past some of the construction, which starts almost as early as 5 a.m. on I-95 and goes on throughout the entire day. So those are 3 railroads, 3 examples of railroads that, being small, were very influential. But before we go, there was one more thing I wanted to play for you here. And this comes from... Your life today? Make a decision. This comes from Bewitched, and we will get this right, I promise. On a new level. Because I saw the RF&P make a little appearance in the pilot of Bewitched. Well, I guess we won't be able to get that for you, but it does make an appearance in the pilot of Bewitched. And so I hope you will watch episode number 1 of Bewitched. And hey, look, I'm not a highly trained broadcast specialist, so we will have a few of those hiccups from time to time, but there is a scene where Darren and Samantha are making out, and you have an RF&P train with an FP7 leading an E8 come right behind them, and they even do make an allusion to going out and watching trains, so it's really enjoyable. We'll link the episode in the description so you can watch it at your leisure without all of the commercials and so forth that YouTube unfortunately likes to put in. So what I hope you'll do is spread this message, share this with your friends and family so that anybody else who likes trains or might become a rail enthusiast or investor or policymaker can learn more about it here at All Things Trains. And in the comments, please share your thoughts and any other topics that you would like us to cover. So we will see you down the main line. As always, we thank you for being here, and I hope you have a great day.